On June the 8th this year, the paper talked about the 150th anniversary of Frank Lloyd Wright's birthday. He was actually born June the 8th, 1867. And I suggested to Diane that my son, Walter, is an architect down in Richmond. And he's been a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright for as long as he can remember, I think. Well, maybe not quite that long, but anyway, he's been a fan of Frank Lloyd Wright for a long time. And I suggested that maybe he could come up and talk to us about Frank Lloyd Wright. He agreed to do that. Diane thought it was a great idea, and so today I have Walter, who is my son, the architect, down in Richmond. And let me tell you just a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright. He was born in the farming town of Richland Center, Wisconsin. And the first picture will show him as a young man. He's credited with designing more than 1,000 structures in his life, and of which 532 were built. His name at birth was Frank Lincoln Wright, and he took Lloyd as his middle name after his parents divorced, and Lloyd was his mother's maiden name. The next picture should be Frank Lloyd Wright is just a little older, and I think Walter should take over from here. Walter, can you tell us a little bit about Frank Lloyd Wright's childhood?
Well, so first of all, Frank Lloyd Wright was probably the most influential American architect of all time.
But yet he was very controversial.
Very controversial. And we'll go through and we'll talk about his early childhood, and we'll talk about his life as we go through, and they are all intermixed.
Oh, good, okay.
How the sort of conflicts between his personal life and his architecture are sort of woven together. When he was young, he was raised by his mother, because his father wasn't there very much, and she was a very domineering person, and she basically educated him out of the house. And this part of her education were these very interesting toys, these blocks that are called Freuble toys.
That's picture number 1, I think.
And those toys are very geometric in the way they're put together, and so his early education had a lot to do with geometries and the way those geometries come together.
Well, you did a lot of that with yourself with Lego, didn't you?
I did.
Okay.
A lot of similarities there, I guess.
Let me not distract you too much here.
That's we talk about that as his education, because his formal education was really sparse. He never graduated from high school. He never graduated from college, and he really sort of was educated in and among the hills of, in the nature of Wisconsin.
But he did have a year of college at the University of Wisconsin, right?
A year or two, it's a couple semesters, I guess.
Yeah, a couple semesters.
Yeah, and so after that, he left Wisconsin and went to Chicago. Chicago was a booming city at the time. It was recovering from the Great Fire. And like all big cities at the time, it was a part of the industrialization of America. Yeah. So we had these influx of people into the cities, and the sort of a way of life was changing. And one of the key people in bringing the architecture of that new time was a guy named Louis Sullivan, who had an office in Chicago, and he's famous for the quote, "Form follows function." And his new architecture and his new buildings were sort of thought of as the future of architecture. And Frank Lloyd Wright shortly got a job with him because
had he learned drafting or something like that somewhere?
He had done several projects before he left Wisconsin.
Oh.
And he had gotten a job at a Chicago architect who's not very famous, but he had worked there for I think a year and a half or 2 years before he landed Sullivan's. Frank Lloyd Wright must have been an excellent talker, because he talked his way into a lot of good spots. I would think so. Not being an architect, not being a graduated architect, it's just right. He must have been the talker. And then very shortly, even though he was not liked by the rest of the draftsmen in the studio, he became the head draftsman. Oh. And he was then shortly put in charge of all the residential projects But before he did the residential projects, he was instrumental. Really, the reason he got hired for Sullivan was for the auditorium, which is we have a photograph of that.
The next picture, I think.
It's a magnificent structure. If you're ever in Chicago, go in to see the auditorium. It's a fantastic building, and it's one of those projects that is a combination of Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright.
Now, is Sullivan's office in the auditorium?
It was upstairs for a period of time. Yes, and that's where Wright worked for him. Obviously after. But then after the auditorium came about, and Wright was started to do all the houses for Sullivan, and they didn't do a lot of houses, but Wright was in charge of them. And that's sort of where a little bit of trouble began, because Wright was spending more money than he made. He loved cars, he fancy clothes, he was building his own house that he got a loan from Mr. Sullivan to start. And
$5,000.
$5,000 was a lot of money in
that's right.
1898.
Yeah.
So he to supplement his income, he started doing houses on the side, and we know of about 10 of them. And Frank Lloyd Wright's style was very, very distinctive. So as Mr. Sullivan's driving down the street one day, he happens to come across one, and he knows who the architect was, and he knows that it wasn't from his office, and he knows that Frank Lloyd Wright has been doing side work. And
he didn't know it, though, until he saw the house.
Once he saw it, right. As soon as he saw the house, he knew who it was and what was going on, and there was no hiding that. And although there are many stories about what happened next, the most believable one is Louis Sullivan fired him on the spot and sent him packing. And so then Wright started his own practice at his home studio. And I think we have a picture of the interior. Oh, no, that's the next house. So then he started to do these prairie houses. And the prairie houses really are what made him famous.
Yeah, his home studio is the next picture.
It was the previous one.
That's
yeah,
it.
There you go.
There we go.
So then he worked into doing the prairie houses.
Well, the Winslow house was before the prairie house. So
The Winslow house was a very early house, and you see
the picture before the studio. Number 3. Go ahead.
Yeah, so there it is, and you can start to see in that house the strong horizontal lines that pick up in the prairie style, and the prairie style became rampant. There are many people that copied it, and no one did as much with it as Wright, and he was the father and leading proponent of the style. But the long horizontal lines, if we could go flip to another house, you can see they're very similar. You have to think about what houses looked like at this time. We're coming out of the Victorian era when houses were very vertical. You think of the steeples and the sharp pointed roofs of the Victorian houses compared to, this is the Roby house.
This is the Roby house now.
This is a very famous house. The extent that he went to emphasize horizontal lines, you can see how far the roof cantilevers, there's nothing supporting it out there. There's a lot of structural gymnastics to get that to work like that. Each brick was elongated. Bricks were much longer than normal. He had them put the mortar in the vertical joints to match the brick and then strike the horizontals.
Oh.
So it's a lot of work for the brick mason.
That was detail, too.
It's a lot of detail.
Yeah.
And it is those kind of design elements that set him dramatically apart from anything else that was going on. And you talk about detail. He would detail furniture. He would detail stained glass. I think we have some stained glass images.
Yeah, I think there we go. We have some stained glasses.
And so each of the houses in this time frame would have decorative glass. The patterns would be created.
We have one other picture of stained glass too.
Individually for each house, and so it was part of a theme. Each house was designed, sort of from the doorknob to to every aspect of the house.
I see so many things in catalogs for Frank Lloyd Wright that has a stained glass motive. So many different items that you can buy that represent Frank Lloyd, even his neckties.
Absolutely. I almost wore one today.
I should have worn mine. I'm saying.
Yeah.
We missed that. We missed on that one, didn't we?
I know.
Okay.
So as he was doing the prairie houses, of course, when you're doing houses, you get very involved with the client, the family that you're working with, and as he got very involved, he happened to get very involved with Mr. Cheney's wife. And Mrs. Cheney and Frank Lloyd Wright then became a very hot topic in Chicago.
Oh.
Because here's this very famous architect, and who's now with I think Cheney was a banker, so it was caused quite a stir.
Wow. And this is while he's still married, I presume.
This is while he's still married.
Uh-oh.
And
he was kind of a ladies' man, I gather.
I would think that's apt.
Okay.
So Mrs. Cheney and Frank Lloyd Wright left the States and actually went to Germany, or went to Europe for a year and a half, maybe two.
Yeah.
And it was there that he made his first publication, which he published all of, or not all of, but very many of his house designs in a German publication, the German Folio. And that sort of set him in an international fame.
So he was actually designing houses for the Germans?
He never got a European commission.
Oh, is that right?
He was there for a couple years, and maybe
he
his
continued to draw and design houses.
his gilded tongue didn't work in German, I guess.
Yeah.
So, but when he became internationally famous, he attracted the attention of the Japanese. He had a fondness for Japan. He'd gone there. He had gotten a bunch of Japanese prints, so he had an affinity for Japan, and he landed a very important commission, which was the Imperial Hotel.
You know, I stayed in the Imperial Hotel.
I do know that.
Yeah, we stayed when I was stationed in Japan, and Betty came over. Your mother came over. That's the hotel we spent our first night. Matter of fact, the first couple of nights in. So go ahead and tell us about the Imperial Hotel.
There were only 200 rooms, so you
Oh, yeah, so I was just.
yeah, you were one of the very few.
It wasn't very big. That's right.
Yeah. Do you know what number the photograph is?
It's the next one, I think.
So.
Do we have the next photograph? It's number 10.
So that's the
No.
Roby House again.
The next one.
There we go. The Imperial Hotel. So it's interesting here. You can see again the sort of sweeping horizontal lines that are common on the prairie houses. But there's a new piece that's introduced into this, which is this sort of Mayan formed bas-relief, which became very important to Wright. You know, from sort of this point on, he designed 4 houses in California that were infamous for this.
Yeah, when we stayed there, that pond was filled with lily pads.
There's some in the
Can
picture.
you see them in there?
Yeah.
There's another picture of the Imperial Hotel from just a little. There it is.
Yeah.
So you see more of it.
It's a fantastic building. It survived a great earthquake.
Well, it was designed to survive earthquakes. That was one of the things. They'd had a tremendous earthquake prior to this.
Right.
And it was designed to and it didn't fall in an earthquake.
And a great thing about that, the design that was part of that design was the foundation. And the foundations were these interlocking pieces that his son used to create Lincoln Logs.
Oh, okay.
And so the creation of Lincoln Logs was by Frank Lloyd Wright's Frank Wright, maybe? They're all named sort of the same.
Oh, okay.
But so that's an offshoot of the creation of the Imperial Hotel.
Ah.
And then the hotel survived the war, World War II.
It did.
That pond was used to put out multiple fires over the course of time. It did not survive the developers in the late 60s.
As a matter of fact, I was there in '55, and I saw no evidence of damage around the hotel. There was other parts of Tokyo that still hadn't been cleaned up, but there was nothing in that area that was a problem.
Yeah. So it was pretty spectacular, and one portion of it has now been rebuilt as sort of a stage in Tokyo.
Okay.
Because it was an important building, and at least somebody regrets tearing it down.
I would hope so. Well, how about the Taliesin building?
So when Wright came back from Europe, and he had this international fame, he went and created this place called Taliesin, and like always, he didn't have the money for it, so he got the land from his mom. He built the house there and created. He used that house to create a studio.
Yeah, I think we have a picture of the Taliesin house.
Taliesin. This is Taliesin East.
Yeah.
And now a terrible, a catastrophic event happened here. He had one of his cooks go insane, and while Wright was in Chicago, the cook burned the house and killed many people who were staying there, including Mrs. Cheney. So that was the end of that sort of period of his
That
life.
must have been devastating for Frank Lloyd Wright, too.
It was devastating for Wright, and he was in Chicago. He ended up having to ride on the train with Mr. Cheney up to Wisconsin, which couldn't have been great either. So sort of the next sort of phase, as Wright, we've been through the booming 20s, things have been great, and then the Depression hits, and there's just not much work to do. And so at Taliesin, he creates this school for architects. So again, always clever way to try and make ends meet. If you don't have a bunch of commissions, get people to pay you to work for you. And it was at that time that I think our next picture is, we're going to go to Taliesin West is the next picture. So this is a little later on when he takes that same scheme to Arizona. And then our next picture should be Falling Water. So at this point in time, he creates probably it's been named the most important piece of architecture in the country, the most important, maybe the most important American house. And then we have 4 photos of this, so we can go through them.
Well, Falling Water is certainly probably the best known of all of his structures around here.
Absolutely. It was built for...
and this is probably one of the most popular views of it, too.
Yeah.
We've got 4 views of it, I think. So.
Yeah. And this one's really interesting. Now, if you look at the way the forms interplay, you can almost see that it could be made out of blocks. Yeah. Right? And so you get a reference back to his early childhood and the way those blocks went together, and the sort of interplay of the horizontal surfaces. Of course, it was not without problems and drama. The big cantilevers were so ahead of their time that the workmen refused to pull the scaffolding out. Yeah, well, there were some big beams in there, as I recall, very deep in the hill. So the beams are actually upturned. He used the rails of the porches, the outside balconies, to be the beams. Mm-hmm. So there weren't beams dropped below. The beams were up above, and they stuck deep into the hill, and that allowed you to cantilever. Yeah, and then cantilever that structure out from that. Right. Yeah. And so when those were done, the workmen wouldn't pull the scaffold out, and Wright himself had to go and pull the supports out from under it and stand underneath it to prove that it would not fall. So a little bit of drama. So you got to have a little faith, huh? Yeah, and he's wearing he always wore the cape. Yeah. And so it was all about a little bit about image. I didn't realize he always wore a cape. He frequently, not always maybe, he frequently wore these long flowing capes. I see. He loved clothes. He was a clothes hound. He loved flashy cars. He was very much
Yeah. Well,
Flash.
the broad acre city concept came out of. Did it come out of this, or?
So at that point of time, when there was not a lot to work on, he created several schemes. The Broadacre City, which was kind of a modern suburb, if you will, the way people think of it.
Before we get on to that, maybe we could go back to the interior of the house, the falling water, because he designed some. I don't know. Did he design some of that furniture?
All of that furniture he designed. The textiles, the kettle that sits at the fireplace. The only thing that he didn't ever design in his houses was the kitchen, because he.
And this was designed for whom?
The Kaufman family.
The Kaufman. And who were they?
They were his client.
Well, they were pretty rich people.
They were absolutely. And they were big patrons of the arts.
Yeah.
I don't know what business Kaufman was in. I don't remember. But there was a Kaufman house.
I don't remember either. It might have been an editor. I thought he might have been an editor or something. But, we went to Frank Lloyd Wright's studios in Pittsburgh. There was in Pittsburgh when we came through there, I don't remember what it was, but anyway, we visited, and it was pretty good size, and there was a lot of things about Frank Lloyd Wright at that time.
Yeah, well, he did several houses in that area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now we go on to the Broadacre City concept. I'm sorry, I wanted to go back to because he did so much design of many furniture.
He did a lot of design of furniture. You talked about the Imperial Hotel earlier. We have plates from the Imperial Hotel that he designed the patterns on.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So, like every aspect of design, he would get involved with. And into Broadacre City, we talked about that that's sort of a plan for the modern suburb. The other one that he did at that time when there was no work was the mile-high skyscraper, which thankfully was never realized.
That would be a little high, wouldn't it?
It would be a problem. And another one, I don't know if it was exactly this time, in Washington, the Crystal Heights, I think it was called, was a large high-rise development that he was doing that received such opposition that and I haven't verified this, but it's always been rumored that that's the time when the height limit was established in D.C.
Oh.
That to keep Frank Lloyd Wright from building.
Oh, he's the one.
Yeah, exactly.
I see. Okay.
One of the suggestions is, but before that time, people just had the good taste not to build higher than the Capitol. Yeah. But Wright's ego was bigger than the Capitol, so he was going to take that on.
Is that typical of architects? Oh, I'm just putting you on. No, it isn't. I know.
Yes?
Go ahead.
All right.
We go on to the Usonian houses.
So and that's really the last one we're going to talk about. So in and among the, if you think about the country and what the country was doing, when he was doing his early work and he was getting into Chicago, it was because the country was having this swelling to the cities. And then sort of post-war, there was a lot of people looking for, there'd been the building had been stagnant really for a long time, since there hadn't been a lot built from the 30s through the mid 40s. And so there was a housing shortage, and so Frank Lloyd Wright's idea was that he was going to create these beautiful houses that were Wright houses that were formed on a grid, and they're sort of machines for living in, if you will. And that they would be a modern house that would deal with modern life, except the car, except the way the kitchen was today. You wouldn't have a maid. It was very different. They were going to be low cost, innovative materials. And he built. This is the Pope Leggy house. This is very close, and architecture being something that one should experience and not see on television.
This is the interior.
Yep.
Can we have the? Do we see the other?
Yeah,
okay.
so that's the outside. And if you think back to the prairie houses, you see the same sort of sweeping horizontal lines. So all those elements are still here. Interesting, he always had an affinity for innovative building techniques, and this building is no exception.
Now, I assume that we can still go into the Pope Lady house.
Yes, you can.
Down at Woodlawn, it's a great thing to go into, and it's a very simple house.
It is. I think it's basically one large living space, a kitchen, and then 3 bedrooms, I believe.
Yeah, something. But
yep.
And it's not the rooms aren't all that large, as I recall. It's really this was built wasn't it the mid 30s, or was it?
No, I think this was
it 40s.
I thought it was late 40s.
Late 40s.
I could be wrong, but I
maybe it was. I'm not sure. But I do remember that, and I haven't been there in 20 years probably. But
yeah, it's been a while.
It's been a while. But I've been there. Well, we've both been there 2 or 3 times.
Yeah. And I think they've done a massive renovation on it since I was there last.
Have they?
Yeah, when I was there, the concrete was cracking because it was placed in the wrong place.
Okay.
Because if you recall, the house
moved it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It wasn't built there. It was relocated there.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, I think it was relocated twice, hadn't it? It was moved from the original foundation, and then I think they moved it one more time.
Yep. So the first time I had seen it, it was moved from that time. So I don't know that I've been back since they
I haven't
readjusted
been back since it was moved again, though.
Yeah.
So now there was another set of houses that came to Washington. If you recall, about 20 or 25 years ago, there was a series of Frank Lloyd Wright houses, little houses, that was on display in Washington. Do you remember?
So those were the Usonian. That was a part of his Usonian dream.
Okay.
He thought everyone. He thought everyone should have, an acre of land. He thought everyone should have an individual house. He wasn't a fan of apartment buildings, and I don't know that he ever did one.
But he didn't live in little houses.
No, he lived in giant sprawling things.
Yeah, the Taliesin.
Taliesin East, and Taliesin West.
Yeah. Those weren't small houses.
No. And most of the houses he designed the house for Johnson & Johnson Wax.
Yeah.
He designed many houses for the very rich.
We've got a little over a minute left, and you took a trip to Chicago just to see. Well, one of the main purposes of the trip was to see Frank Lloyd Wright houses. What'd you see there?
So that was the spring green trip we did.
That was shortly after you were married. Shortly after you became an architect, really.
I was before. I was still in school.
Oh, you're still in school?
Yeah. We went and saw all the Oak Park houses.
Oh, yeah.
And I guess you could walk. You can walk from one to the other.
Yeah.
It's an amazing neighborhood. It really is worth a visit because. It's not frequent that you have a spectacular house after spectacular house.
Okay, now, how has Frank Lloyd Wright influenced you in your architecture? Now, you've been an architect since 1985, and I think I've seen probably some elements of Frank Lloyd Wright in some of the things you've done. Maybe even that car barn. That might even be. There might be something about Frank Lloyd Wright in that.
Well, so, the way Wright put together compositions is very compelling, and I think, he was right about a lot of things.
Yeah.
He wasn't right about them all.
Well, maybe you ought to come back and talk to us about your own buildings someday. Would you do that?
Well, maybe next week. Is that
Well,
right? Or whenever?
I don't know, but I think I would like to do that. If you'd like to tell us about some of the buildings you've done in Richmond, do you think that Frank Lloyd Wright has influenced you in your thinking about buildings?
I think he's influenced every architect.
Every architect.
Either pro or con. You're going to see what he's done, and you're going to react to it either positively or negatively. I won't ever do that. Yeah, exactly. Or I like this, and I'll work that in. Yeah.
All right. Now, I want you to know that Wally has Lego models of the of the Falling Water house, the museum, the
The Guggenheim,
Guggenheim Museum, and one other.
Imperial Hotel.
Imperial Hotel. Okay.
Yeah.
He's got Lego models of this that I gave him 2 of them because I know he likes to work on Lego and Frank Lloyd Wright. So, and also I've given him a lot of doodads. It's had the stained glass in them and all that sort of thing. So I know that Wally has a lot of Frank Lloyd Wright stuff. And Walter, I'm sorry. Well, anyway, Walter, thank you for coming and talking to us about Frank Lloyd Wright. I've enjoyed it, and I hope the other residents here have enjoyed too, learning a little bit more about Frank Lloyd Wright and the influence he's had on architecture and in our country. So thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.